After Jesus had shared the Last Supper with his disciples in that upper room, he led them from that sacred space out toward the Mount of Olives. And as they walked toward the Mount of Olives, they came to a garden called Gethsemane. And when they entered into that garden, Jesus said to the disciples, "I need for most of you to stay here and just wait." But then he pulled aside Peter, James, and John, and he said, "I need the three of you to come with me." As they began to walk deeper into the garden, Scripture tells us that Jesus became agitated, that he became deeply upset and filled with grief. And he turned to Peter, James, and John, and he told them about what was going on in his spirit, how troubled he was, how frightened he was. He said, "I am even grieved to the point of death." And he said to them, I need you to do something for me that's very important. I need for the three of you to sit here with me, and I need you to watch over me while I go and pray. Now, it's important to remember that Jesus didn't go very far after he made that request. He told the disciples that their job was to watch over him, which tells us that they could see him. So Jesus says, "Watch over me while I pray." And he begins to walk deeper into the garden, and not far from where the disciples sat watching, we're told that Jesus threw himself on the ground. I want you to just let that sit with you for a moment. Jesus didn't sit down slowly and gently. He didn't go over to a rock and pose himself on it with hands folded and eyes pointed upward, as many artists have depicted in the Garden of Gethsemane. This was not a pastoral moment. This was not a moment that was easy to watch. Jesus threw himself on the ground. And in that lumped up, thrown on the ground posture, he cried out to God, "Please, don't make me do this. I don't want to do this. I don't think I can do this. Please, take this cup from me." We don't know how long he prayed or how many things he said, but we know he said that. And after some time, he also, and I can't imagine that he said these words with great confidence just yet. He concluded that moment of prayer by saying to God, "Not my will be done, but yours." And then he stood up, he dusted the dirt off of his clothes that had gotten on them after he fell to the ground. And he walked back to the disciples. And when he got to them, he found that they weren't watching over him. In fact, they were sleeping. And Jesus, he woke them up. He said, "Could you not just stay awake and watch over me for 1 hour? Could you not do the one thing that I asked you to do, even though it was only for 1 hour?" And then he turned to Peter as if he was reading his mind, and he said, "I know that the spirit is willing, but the flesh, it's weak. I need you to watch over me while I pray." With those words, Jesus left the disciples awake and watching as he went back and threw himself on the ground again and continued to pray, "Dear God, take this cup from me. Not my will, but your will be done." Getting up again, dusting himself off, and going back to the disciples a second time, only to find them back asleep. But this time, Jesus doesn't say anything to them. He doesn't wake them up. He doesn't stir them at all. He just looks at them and then in silence returns back to pray. And I think that in that silence, Jesus speaks volumes. You know, sometimes we're so overcome. Sometimes we're so disappointed. Sometimes we're so dismayed that there are no words. He had asked these 3 disciples to watch over him, to do something exceedingly important for him, and they had failed not once, but now they had failed twice, and this time, instead of waking them and getting them to continue to watch over them, Jesus just it's almost as if he just gives up, and he goes back, and for the 3rd time, he falls to the ground, and he prays again, "Oh God, please, please, please. I can't do this. Take this cup from me. Not my will be done, but your will be done." This is one of the most honest, one of the most real, and one of the most difficult moments in the story of Jesus. It's a story where we see the fullness of his humanity. Yes, he was fully divine, but Jesus was also fully human. And in this moment, he was afraid and worried. He knew how he was going to die. He knew what was going to happen. And he was rightfully scared about that. And after the 3rd time, he asked God to take that cup away from him. And after the 3rd time, he uttered those words maybe a little more confidently than the times he had offered it before. "Not my will, but your will be done." Jesus gets up and he goes back to the disciples who were supposed to be watching over him, but they're still sleeping, and he wakes them up and he says, "The hour is at hand. I'm about to be betrayed over to the hands of sinners." And even at that moment, they were showing up to take Jesus away. When we hear this story, when we read this story, it's a reasonable question for us to ask as to why did the disciples fall asleep? Why couldn't they stay awake as they watched their Lord and Master, their Messiah, their teacher, their friend that they loved? Why couldn't they just stay awake as he prayed? Maybe they were just tired. Maybe they were full from dinner. They'd had a full meal and it had gone late into the night, and they'd gone out into the garden and the darkness of night was there. Maybe they were just fatigued and their bodies were tired and they needed rest, and so they let their eyes close and they fell asleep. Maybe it was nothing more than just the fatigue you and I feel at the end of a day. But maybe, just maybe, there was something else. Maybe, as they sat and watched Jesus throw himself to the ground, and as they heard Jesus express his fear and his worries and his hesitations, maybe it just got so hard for them to watch that in spite of how willing their spirits were to sit with him in his moment of need, it just hurt too much. Have you ever been in so much pain that you just can't stay awake? And your eyes get heavy, and sleep overtakes you, even if you didn't want it to. I'm not so sure that the disciples fell asleep because they were tired, but because this was an impossible moment to watch, and they just needed to look away. Over the course of the last few weeks, we've been talking in the sanctuary about issues of race, bias, in our country, in our community, and in ourselves. And there have been times it's been a difficult conversation. The purpose of this series was to help us prepare for a conversation that's going to be led by our elders beginning tonight. We're going to meet tonight at 6:30. We're going to meet around tables, and we're going to begin a conversation where we're going to open ourselves up, and we're going to learn, and we're going to study, and we're going to find ways that we can restore the beloved community of God in the midst of our communities and our families and our churches and all of those things. That journey's starting tonight, and we hope that you'll come and be a part of it. The purpose of this series was just to get us ready for that. I hope that the series has been good, but I really believe that the transformation for all of us is going to happen in conversation. It's going to happen when we begin to share stories and we begin to listen and we begin to do the hard work of navigating through some of these difficult topics. When we planned this series months ago, we knew that it was going to be an important time for us to talk about this issue because it's always an important time to talk about this issue. But then last Saturday with the events of Charlottesville and everything that's happened this week, all the stuff, It has been made abundantly clear just how important and how relevant this conversation really is. As we geared up for both the preaching series and the class, I was excited because it's so important. And I was really looking forward to this conversation and the work that we were going to do together, and my spirit was just filled with anticipation for us having the chance to get together and talk about something that's so important, I think. But after everything that's happened, after all this stuff over the course of the last 7 or 8 days, I just got to tell you, right now I'm just tired. I am so tired of talking about this. I'm tired of arguing about it. I'm tired of watching it on TV and reading it in the news and across my social media feeds. I am just absolutely exhausted. And I'm not talking about the casual kind of tired that you feel at the end of a long day. I'm talking about the kind of tired that clings to you like humidity at a church party on a hot August day. I'm talking about the kind of tired that just seeps into your bones, the kind of tired that you can taste in your mouth. I'm tired of this. But I know that as tired as I am, I'm not the only person who's exhausted. My guess is that some of you are pretty tired of all this as well. But as tired as you and I may be, think about how tired the people of color are in our communities and in our churches and around the world who constantly face this and don't have the luxury of turning away. If you and I think we're tired, think how tired they must be. Friends, they're exhausted. And here's the thing. No matter how tired we are, we cannot go to sleep. We cannot close our eyes. We cannot seek distraction or rest. We've got to keep our ears to the ground. We've got to keep our eyes open. We've got to continue to hear things that are hard to hear. We've got to continue to see things that are hard to see. Just because we close our eyes and our ears to those things doesn't mean that they're not happening. They are. And we've got to stay awake, and we've got to recognize those things, and we've got to see those things. But look, I get it. It's so hard to do that. It's exhausting. Sometimes it just wears us out. And one of the temptations that we have as a people when we dive into a conversation like this is we kind of want to resist it. We want to press back against it. And I think the reason that we want to press against it isn't because we're bad people or we don't think it's real. I think it's because it's hard. You know, in our experience as a multiracial family, there have been moments along the journey where we've shared our story. Some of the things that have happened to us as a family, some of the things that have happened to our son. And as we've done that, we found ourselves standing beside people of color who have shared similar stories in their life, similar things that have happened to them. And as we've shared our story, we've had a window open to us into the reality of other people when they try to tell their stories. And that reality is sometimes, even when I sit down with people I know and who know me, and I tell them our story, their first response isn't to hear it as truth. The first response is to say something like, "Are you sure that's what happened? Do you think they really meant that? Are you positive you're interpreting this in the right way? Are you sure that Ethan didn't do something to merit the response that he got?" And though not often, we've even had some people question the truth or veracity of our story at all. Initially, as that began to happen to us, and I began to recognize that this was also something that was happening to other people, my first response was one of anger. I'm sitting right before you, and you know me, and I'm telling you my story. How can you not believe that it's true? How can you not believe that it's real? How can you not believe that this is happening to us? And I was angry about it. So I understand the anger of people When no matter how loud they tell their story or how often they tell their story, that our response is to look at them and say, are you sure? Maybe you're misinterpreting it. Did you do something that would make them respond or act in that way? But as I move away from my anger, and I try to remember that a lot of the people who have this response are people that love me. I'm thinking they're not responding in this way because they don't care about me. Maybe, just maybe they're responding in this way because it hurts so much to think about the fact that this might be true. Maybe, just maybe, they're like Peter, James, and John who are sitting there and they're being asked to listen, to watch over, to pray with. But as they hear the stories and see the reality, it just becomes so hard to hear, so hard to imagine, and so exhausting that the lids start to close. And the eyes grow weary and the heart grows tired. And we just want anything to be true but what we're hearing. And in those moments, in our own way, we kind of fall asleep. Friends, we got to stay awake. You know, I don't think that Peter, James, and John fell asleep because they were bad people. And I don't think that we respond sometimes the way we do when it comes to hearing these stories because we're bad people. We're good people. And I know that I've said this every week through this series, but I want to say it again, and I want to be very clear about it. I do not believe that you are racist. I think we've thrown this word around in ways that is oversimplified what is a very complex issue. Racism is that overarching thing where there are systems, both by law and by practice, that oppress a people of a certain ethnicity or color based on those things alone. And I do not believe that most people think that based on ethnicity or skin, they should be below someone else. That's racism. I do not believe that you are a racist people. I am not a racist person. But just because we aren't racist and we don't believe or adhere or espouse any of those kinds of beliefs, that doesn't mean that we don't have some biases that live inside of us. Some tapes that play from long ago, some things that cause us to assume things that aren't there, to see things that aren't there, to guess things that are there, to kind of put together a story that may or may not be true. That's this bias that lives within us. Just because you've got bias in you doesn't mean you're a racist person. And I'm so afraid of this response when we start to talk about this and someone comes to me and they say, hey, Brian, you know what you just said there? That's a little biased. And they may even say, you know what you said there? That's a little racist. And when someone says that, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. I am not a racist. Right? I'm not. And I don't believe that you are either. Friends, as I've shared in this series, I've got some bias. If we can't at least admit that we've got that without taking that extra step of those biases making us really wholly bad people, I don't think we're ever going to get to where we need to be when it comes to all of this stuff. As hard as it was for the disciples as they were sitting there watching Jesus go through this moment, it was about to get a lot harder, right? They took Jesus right then, and they took him and they put him through this false accusation, this court that found him guilty of charges of which he was not guilty. Then they tortured him, and they hung him on a cross, and he died. And then they took his body and they put it in a tomb, and they rolled a big stone over the tomb, and they sealed it. They sealed it because they expected it to be permanent. If you think it was hard for the disciples to watch Jesus pray, imagine how hard it was for them to watch them roll that stone over his tomb. They thought all had been lost, that death had won, and it was over. And they were scared, and they were tired. But on the third day, early in the morning, the women woke up and they went to the tomb, and the stone that had been sealed was rolled away. And they looked in, and the body was no longer there. Jesus had been raised. He had defeated death. He was resurrected. He had overcome. And in his resurrection, he had given them a new life that wasn't there before, even a life that was eternal. But before that life could be given, there was first death. Friends, if we ever want to get to that place where we experience the fullness of the beloved community that God has created us to be, there's some things that are going to need to die. Anger, resistance, arrogance, blame, fear, bias. There's some things that are going to need to die. And I wish I could tell you that the dying process is easy, but sometimes it's painful. And sometimes it hurts. And sometimes it's hard to watch. And sometimes it's hard to be a part of. And as we go through these conversations over the next several weeks, and as you work through this stuff on your own outside of this building, there are going to be moments where it is likely so hard that you want nothing more than to go to sleep. And yeah, you should be a little nervous about this. But it's okay. Jesus was nervous and afraid and worried too. But this is what I believe. I believe that just as is true with Jesus' story, if we can put those things to death, we too may find a resurrection where all of God's children are seen for who they are. There is no condemnation, there is no elevation or subjugation. There is none of that happens in spite of who we may be and who we were born to be. We are all seen as the children of God that we fully are. Imagine a world where instead of fearing people who were different from us, we embraced them, and we loved them, and we celebrated them, and we encouraged them to reach their full potential, because only when they reach their full potential, and we all reach our full potential, will we ever be the people that God has called us to be. But in order to get there, some things are going to die. They're going to have to die. But I believe that ultimately there will be new life. And when that life comes, it'll be better than the place we're living right now. And when that life comes, we'll restore the beloved community. We will love our neighbors as ourselves. And we might just discover that heaven isn't just a place that's waiting for us after we die. It can be found right here, right now. Amen.